I want you to think with me for a moment about the ideal gift or toy for a child. Take your own being into care by going on an imaginary shopping trip with Luca Irigaray and Aristotle. In the physics, Aristotle differentiates between a zoon, a living being, a living thing, and made products, poiomenon. In the case of technology, or made products, things have their cause or their nature, their essence, imported to them from somewhere else. Aristotle tells a joke here, which he borrows from Antiphon. What do you get when you plant a bed? You get trees, right? Because the essence or the cause of a bed, to speak of cell phones and social media, is techne, right? In contrast, living beings, like plants or animals, but also simple bodies like water, earth, fire, and air, have their cause in themselves. The idea of an element is that you can use it for something else, to make something else, but it's not the product of anything. So the difference between simple bodies and technology isn't their degree of their complexity, but that technology has a purpose, at least much more so, foreclosed or supplied to it from the beginning. It's already supplied when it's made. In contrast, a living being has an essence in itself, which Irigaray says opens up infinitely to a world. It's counterintuitive for us who live in such a technological age, but the point is that you can actually do much more with a piece of clay than you can with a smartphone. This links on to Irigaray's grief that children in our world are more and more so being given fabricated objects to enframe fabricated paradigms. And forgive me, but I'm going to read a very, very long passage here from page 21 and 22 of Irigaray's To Be Born. In this entire course, this paragraph and the description of immortality by Diotima are my favorite pieces of text. No doubt, she says, it's regrettable that the environment in which the child carries on investigating is more and more made up of fabricated objects and not of living beings. Indeed, beyond the fact that its perception is then partial, its vitality also fails for lack of energetic communication or communion with what it approaches. And if sight and touch remained the senses most solicited, it would be relevant to wonder about what sorts of looking and touching are then in question. Are they perceptions in which a reciprocity remains effective, or instead a first attempt to master and to take possession of the world by a budding technocrat? If the child opens out to a world which is no longer opening to it, what will happen to its own becoming? Will it turn into a demiurge lacking energy? Only living beings come into presence by themselves and offer the little child who opens to them their own opening to its world. The meeting between the young explorer and pieces of its environment ought to correspond to, or at least render possible, an articulation between two worlds, the fitting of which is provided by life itself. In this way, neither the world nor the little human will dominate over one another in a kind of conflicting dilemma between subjectivity and objectivity. Different appearances of life will fertilize one another, and the opening up of the child to the world will contribute toward its own blossoming as living, which cannot occur if the child is surrounded only by fabricated objects, the existence of which already amounts to human work and doesn't provide a living presence and energy in a will. The relationship of dominating dominated then risks being the one which organizes the world in which the child is situated. And if it enjoys a power, at least a virtual power, over its surroundings, because this results from a human making, it is also a slave to this world, as for a greater part, it meets its needs and thus it cannot do without it. Moreover, instead of opening up to it as a living world can do, such a fabricated universe commands not only the child's needs, but also its gestures and even its thoughts. Consider in our imaginary shopping trip with Irigaray and Aristotle, the contrast on the one hand between a Fisher-Price toy, maybe a mobile, one of those toys that has a lot of buttons and levers on it, whistles and doors that open and so on. The one that I find in our home is this hammer and plastic surface. You'll be familiar with this. You hit one and another one pops up. Every one of the movements here is preformed for us. But what Irigaray is primarily concerned about here is the way that our gestures, right? But not only our gestures, but even our interests, our thoughts, she says, and most damningly, our needs, right? Our desires, are prefabricated, pre-programmed, predetermined for us. In contrast, a piece of clay, a piece of dirt, Neil deGrasse Tyson will talk about an egg in this way, doesn't do anything, and so would seem to be the far inferior toy, and yet it's not doing anything. Its simplicity, its elemental character is in fact the potential of what Aristotle calls a living being. The made product would seem to be the superior toy because it provides almost unlimited entertainment for the young child and, I might add, the distracted caregiver. But in contrast, the Play-Doh, which doesn't do anything, has plasticity and openness, an openness to being as its way of being or its essence. In Irigaray's language, it opens a whole world to the child. In contrast, the fabricated object somehow, Irigaray says, commands our, or the child's needs, and gestures, and even thoughts. Consider the way that smartphones do this for us. We see this best when smartphones don't work or when our signal is interrupted, when we can't put them down even for a moment, when we fumble with them unknowingly. We feel the way that they create and command our needs, our gestures, our thoughts, our desires, our maybe sometimes being created for us by the implements in our lives. The danger isn't that we become dependent on technology to communicate or to do our jobs. Of course we are dependent on technology to communicate or to do our jobs. The danger is that the technology itself becomes a job for us, that it dictates to us what we want, what we need, what we will do, that it begins to think for us or to replace thinking. Irigaray has one more helpful contrast here when she talks about reflections or projections and work. Consider that the human condition for Irigaray doesn't exist. That is, unlike plants or animals who have their identities provided in their genetic makeup and in their environmental situation, rather, the human condition has to be taken under our care and recreated anew in every instance. How do I know who I am? We can consider two models here for image making of the self. And the first would be the mirror reflection. It would seem that the mirror image is a perfectly meticulous representation of who I am. But notice that this projection only reflects the surface. We might say the product, none of the work of being myself. The mirror image is frozen in time and cannot represent my identity as a trajectory, as an ongoing unfolding. In contrast, the work of art, which may not be a very accurate depiction of my physical features, can somehow show the workmanship, the creatorliness of identity formation. The danger isn't that we'll use our smartphones too much, but that we take these externally derived, Irigaray calls them suprasensitive patterns, for definitions or standards of what the self is meant to be. And I'll end with one final quote from page 38. Human beings resort for their development to a fabricated paradigm, which has no energy by itself. Imposing it on a boy or a girl as a way or a model towards their becoming means destroying the dynamism conforming to their living being. Consequently, they lose the source of their natural energy and the possibility of growing in accordance with it. It is thus understandable that humans consider earthly sojourn as an exile and not a place where they can blossom. They've become a kind of fabricated project, like the toy, the functioning of which is ruled by a supersensitive pattern and an ideal extraneous to their real being, and which are impracticable by them.